Political instability has rocked East Africa's economic boat, particularly in Burundi. Joining me now to discuss the ramifications is Suresh Chaytoo, Sector Director at RMB. Suresh, welcome.
Thanks, Natasha.
Now, we've seen the news inflow of the coup. We said alleged, but now we know it is a coup d'etat in Burundi. Of course, it could have serious financial ramifications, not only for the country, but for the region as well. From a banking perspective, which regional banks have exposure to the Burundi market, and what does this mean for them?
I think, Natasha, it's important to understand sort of the size of the banking sector in Burundi. It's quite small when you look at the rest of East Africa communities. So they've got a banking sector in total asset size of about $342 million. This compares to a sort of GDP of 110 billion for the East Africa community. There are 3 banks that have a presence in Burundi, mainly Kenyan banks and obviously EcoBank, which is a regional bank, and it's Diamond Trust and KCB. But their banking franchises are quite small. So when you look at that in context in terms of impact on earnings, I don't see a formidable impact in terms of Kenyan banking sector earnings. I do worry, though, that the impact this would make in the Burundian banking sector, because it's very small, it's very concentrated, if this situation does become a bit more protracted.
So it could create a bit of fragility there. Let's talk about interregional trade. Of course, the EAC grouping, Burundi part of that. We've got the big powerhouses, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda on the one side. The so-called last kid on the block, Tanzania on the other, and Burundi kind of stuck in the middle. What could this do for interregional trade in an area which to date has really worked together, if you compare it to a region like SADC?
You're absolutely right. I think the Burundi and all of the East Africa regional partners have their GDPs have been very, very dependent on intra-regional trade, which has been growing at a phenomenal rate. And I think the East Africa community system has definitely worked when it came to intra-regional trade. Burundi is still relatively very small. If you look at East Africa community, their GDP is about 3 billion compared to 110 billion, which is the total sector. So again, I think Burundi would be affected if there is a knock-on effect from an intra-regional trade perspective, if the East African community decides to place, for example, embargoes in regards to trade. Although I must say that I don't envisage, I think trade will continue. Intra-regional trade, I don't think will be that much affected. One, because you'd find that the powerhouses of Kenya, Tanzania, and particularly in Rwanda, serving the sort of East Africa interests of South Sudan, etc., I think will continue, irrespective of what happens in Burundi.
Let's move from Burundi to Tanzania. What are the prospects for Tanzania's banking sector? Because we know, I jokingly said the last kid on the block, last mover advantage, but what's going on there?
So I think it's been moving at a very, very relatively slower rate in terms of growth. If you look at the Tanzanian banking sector, still relatively small compared to the East African partners. I think also the corporate sector has been quite nascent. So the growth of the banking sector has largely been predicated on the economic growth, particularly in the corporate sector in Tanzania, which has been very, very slow. FirstRand does have a presence in Tanzania, full presence there on the ground. And what we have found is that it's been relatively difficult to sort of have massive growth rates when you have a very, very slower corporate sector. But I think what we are starting to see is perhaps a more regional play in Tanzania. We have seen some of the major banks now looking sort of in East Africa and trying to get a foothold in the rest of East Africa, which I think will help in terms of diversifying their earnings, but also provide a lot more ability for them to deploy their balance sheets in a territory that they know very, very well.
Now, speaking of Tanzania as well, their role in interregional trade, let's say in comparison to Big Brother like Kenya?
I think they play a significant role because, you know, they have got very, very good ports in Dar es Salaam. They do act they have acted in the past as a regional hub. I think what needs to happen, which I think has been recognized by the Tanzanian authorities, is investment. We need to improve road infrastructure. We need to look at improving and investing further into the ports. And one of the key things that I think the Tanzanian authorities recognize is that they need to have this differentiated competitive advantage. And I think with growing interest now from Japan on the continent, and Japan is a core trading partner for Tanzania. We've seen India making now significant investments into the country. I think it would be exciting to see what happens over the next 2 to 3 years. But you're certainly right. They do have a bit of catch up to do when compared to Kenya. But having a port and having sort of an entry level into the rest of East Africa, I think is a distinct advantage when you compare them to the likes of Rwanda and Uganda.
When you look at the EAC grouping as a whole, though, what do you see the potential for the region going forward?
I think it's massive. If you just look at the way the banking sector, for example, in Kenya has grown through regionalization, you can just but imagine if Tanzanian banks start investing into Rwanda or South Sudan or to Burundi or Uganda, for example, I think it's quite an exciting place. And just by judging from sort of the earnings potential and look at the earnings growth and the efficiencies that's been created within the banking sector, I think the East Africa community is a place to watch.
Now, interestingly enough, I spoke to Visa yesterday about their foray into the East African market now with the introduction of EMV cards, but also speaking to them about the competitiveness against the mobile money market. How's that playing out in your vision?
So what's been happening is that I think the mobile money market has enabled a lot of the unbanked sector, has been able to mobilize getting bankability to the unbanked sector in the rural areas, etc. So I think mobile money will and will continue to play or has and will continue to play a pivotal role in terms of getting bankability of those clients. And also I think banks are now starting to latch on how they actually integrate this mobile money into their systems as such. So I see this sort of the banking and the mobile money being one integrated financial system over the next coming years.
Interesting times ahead. Suresh Chaytoo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Suresh Chaytoo, Sector Director at RMB.